In the summer of 1946, with the Second World War barely over, the United States Navy assembled something close to an armada. Almost 5,000 men, 13 ships, dozens of aircraft, an aircraft carrier, even a submarine, and sent it to the most hostile place on the planet. Its destination was Antarctica, and the official reason was almost boring: training and mapping, practice for the cold. But think about that for a second. The war was over, money was tight, and the Navy chose to send one of the largest forces it had ever gathered in peacetime to a frozen, empty continent where no enemy lived, and then pulled it out suddenly after only a few weeks. That gap between the enormous effort and the modest explanation, between going in huge and leaving early, is exactly the space where a legend grew. A legend about Nazis and flying saucers and a secret battle beneath the ice. This is the true story of Operation Highjump, and it is a story about how a real event becomes a myth, and about the man who deliberately built that myth decades later for reasons of his own. This is the Long Archives, where we set the documented record beside the legend and show you where they part. If you like the facts kept clean from the fantasy, subscribe and stay to the end. There is a new entry every Sunday. To understand why America sent a fleet to the ice, you have to understand the moment. It was 1946. The largest war in history had just ended, and almost immediately a new and colder rivalry was taking its place. The United States suddenly had the biggest navy on Earth, a vast force built for a war that was now over. And a strategic problem: the next confrontation, if it came, might be fought across the top and bottom of the world, over the poles, in conditions no army had ever truly mastered. Antarctica was the last unclaimed continent, a wilderness larger than the United States, mapped only in fragments, touched only at its edges. Whoever learned to operate there, to fly and supply and survive in that cold, would hold an advantage. And there was prestige in it too. In an age of superpowers, presence at the ends of the earth was a statement of reach. There was also the simple problem of what to do with a colossal military machine that no longer had a war. The United States had built, almost overnight, the most powerful navy the world had ever seen. And peace had arrived before all that power could be spent. Antarctica offered a use, a vast, brutal proving ground where ships and aircraft and men could be tested against an enemy that never surrendered and never negotiated: the cold itself. If the next war really was going to be fought across the poles, then the nation that had practiced there would be ready, and the nation that had not would be blind. The man chosen to embody that statement was already a living legend. Rear Admiral Richard Byrd had spent 2 decades exploring the polar regions. He was famous for flights over both poles and for surviving a brutal solo winter in Antarctica years before. That last feat had very nearly killed him. In 1929, Byrd had been part of the first flight ever made over the South Pole. A few years later, he insisted on manning a weather station entirely alone, in a hut buried beneath the ice shelf, through the Antarctic winter, and almost died there, slowly poisoned by carbon monoxide leaking from a faulty stove, scribbling failing notes in the dark until a rescue party reached him, frostbitten and barely alive. He had faced the continent at its worst and lost badly, and gone back anyway. There was no living person whose name was more completely bound to Antarctica. For the public, Byrd was Antarctica. Putting his name on the operation guaranteed the world would pay attention. The naval force itself, Task Force 68, was placed under the operational command of another Admiral, Richard Cruzen, while Byrd led the scientific side and served as the expedition's famous face. And the force was staggering. Some 4,700 men, 13 ships, including an aircraft carrier and a submarine, 33 aircraft. It remains to this day one of the largest expeditions ever sent to Antarctica. The Navy gave it a name: Operation Highjump. What that force actually did when it got there was hard, cold, unglamorous work. The fleet was split into 3 groups. A central group carried the icebreakers and the supply ships that would push toward the Ross Ice Shelf and rebuild a base camp, Little America 4, on the same stretch of ice where Byrd had camped on earlier expeditions. 2 other groups of ships and seaplanes swung wide to the east and west to survey the coastline from the air. The hardware was serious. At the center was an aircraft carrier, the Philippine Sea, serving as the expedition's flagship. There was a submarine, the Senate, sent to test how a vessel like it would handle the pack ice. And there were icebreakers like the Northwind, whose brute job was to smash a path through the frozen sea for everything behind them. This was not a science cruise with a few hardy volunteers. It was outfitted and it moved like a fleet going to war. Only the enemy was the cold, because mapping was the real prize. From the carrier and the seaplanes, crews flew long photographic missions over the Antarctic coast, capturing tens of thousands of aerial photographs of territory no human eye had ever seen. It was the most ambitious aerial survey of the continent ever attempted. There was a catch, which mattered later. Many of those photographs were taken without enough fixed reference points on the ground to pin them to exact locations, which limited how useful they were for true map-making. But the scale was real. In a few weeks, Highjump photographed more of Antarctica than all previous expeditions combined. In all, something like 70,000 aerial photographs. And because so many of them lacked fixed reference points on the ground, the Navy had to send a second, smaller expedition the very next year. Operation Windmill, whose unglamorous task was to land survey parties on the coast and plant the control points that would finally turn Highjump's photographs into usable maps. The grand expedition, in other words, needed a quiet sequel just to cash in what it had gathered. There is nothing in that sequence that looks like a cover-up. Only the ordinary plodding follow-through of real science. And alongside the cameras came the test equipment. This was, in Byrd's own description, primarily a military training mission. A chance to learn whether modern ships, modern planes, and the brand new helicopters could actually function in the most extreme cold on Earth. The answer often was barely. Engines failed. Metal grew brittle. The pack ice trapped and threatened the ships. Men worked in conditions that punished every mistake. This was not a parade. It was a stress test, run at the edge of what machines and bodies could take, and the continent pushed back hard. The brand new helicopters were a revelation and a frustration at once. Nimble enough to lift men and cameras to places no seaplane could reach, fragile enough to be grounded by the very weather that mattered most. Frostbite waited for any careless minute. A storm could erase a day's plan in an hour. Engines that ran fine in a temperate harbor seized in the Antarctic air. Every lesson the operation learned, it learned the hard way, which was, in truth, the entire point. Far better to find the limits of your machines and your men in a training exercise than to discover them for the first time in a war. How hard it pushed became clear on the 30th of December 1946. A large seaplane, a PBM Mariner that the crews had nicknamed George I, was flying a reconnaissance mission when it ran into a whiteout, that disorienting Antarctic condition where snow, cloud, and ground blur into a single featureless white and the horizon simply disappears. The aircraft struck a slope on Thurston Island and crashed. 3 of the 9 men aboard were killed. Ensign Maxwell Lopez and 2 others, Wendell Henderson and Frederick Williams. The 6 survivors were stranded on the ice in the cold and were not rescued until 13 days later. It was the operation's worst tragedy, and importantly, an accident. A crash in a whiteout, the kind of death the Antarctic has handed out to explorers for a century. And then, after only a few weeks of operations, Operation Highjump ended, abruptly and far earlier than its planners had once imagined. The reason was not mysterious. The brief Antarctic summer was closing. Winter, with its killing cold and its expanding ice, was coming on fast, and the fleet risked being trapped. The pack ice was already tightening around the fleet. At least one ship had to work hard to avoid being locked in, and the commanders knew that to linger was to risk losing vessels and men to the freeze. So in late February of 1947, the ships turned north and went home. The greatest expedition ever sent to the ice had lasted a single season. That is the entire shape of the real event. A huge, ambitious, partly successful military exercise that mapped a great deal of coastline, tested equipment to its breaking point, lost 3 men in a crash, and withdrew ahead of the winter. Impressive, costly, and, by the standards of legend, almost anticlimactic. And yet, for all its rough edges and its early exit, Highjump genuinely mattered. It gave the world its first broad aerial look at an entire continent. Its data and its hard-won lessons fed directly into the great scientific push of the following decade and helped lay the groundwork for the remarkable treaty signed in 1959 that set Antarctica aside, uniquely among the Earth's territories, for peace and science rather than conquest. The true legacy of Operation Highjump was not a battle beneath the ice. It was the slow, unglamorous opening of the last continent to human knowledge. But on the way home, Byrd gave an interview that the legend would later seize on. Speaking to a reporter aboard the flagship, he warned that the United States needed to take the threat of attack seriously, that in a future war, the country could be struck by aircraft flying over the poles. He was talking plainly about the Soviet Union and the new geography of the atomic age, in which bombers might one day cross the Arctic. But strip those words from their context, twist the translation, and you can make a polar explorer sound as though he is warning about something far stranger coming out of the ice, which is exactly what would be done with them. So how did a cold, half-finished mapping mission become a secret war against Nazi flying saucers? The answer is a small masterclass in how myths are built, out of a few real ingredients and one deliberate lie. Start with the real ingredients. First, secrecy, a military operation with classified elements that the public only half understood. Second, that warning from Byrd. In a Chilean newspaper interview on the way home, his plain caution that the United States could one day be attacked by planes flying over the poles was, in later retellings, mistranslated and bent until he seemed to be describing craft of impossible speed and power. The same handful of words read two ways: a general worrying about Soviet bombers or an admiral hinting at flying saucers. Only the first is what he actually said. And third, the genuine seed. The fact that Nazi Germany really had sent an expedition to Antarctica before the war, in 1938 and 1939, and had even claimed a slice of the continent. That expedition was real. It was also brief, lightly equipped, and built no secret fortress. But it was just enough truth to hang a fantasy on. For decades, that was all there was. Loose rumor. The fantasy took its final specific shape much later, and it did not appear by accident. In the 1970s, a story began to circulate that Highjump had not really been about training at all, that Byrd's fleet had gone south to find and destroy a hidden Nazi base, and had been driven off by advanced flying craft rising out of the ice. And the men most responsible for spreading that version were not neutral storytellers. One of the principal authors, writing under a pen name, was in reality Ernst Zündel, a notorious neo-Nazi propagandist and Holocaust denier. That detail is the key to the whole thing, so sit with it. The secret Nazi base in Antarctica story was not just a harmless campfire tale. It was promoted in large part by someone with a motive. A man who wanted to keep alive the fantasy that the Nazi regime had not truly been defeated, that somewhere secretly it survived, advanced and undefeated, with wonder weapons the Allies could not touch. A myth of invincible Nazis hidden at the bottom of the world is propaganda dressed as mystery, and it spread, as those things do, far faster and far wider than the dull truth ever could. The myth has a second head, too. Running alongside the Nazi base story is a stranger one, that Byrd kept a secret diary describing how he flew, not over the pole, but through an opening into a hollow earth, into a hidden green land of warmth and ancient beings. There is no such diary in any archive. It appears in no official record and in none of Byrd's verified writings. It surfaces only in much later books that sell fiction as fact. Set against it is the actual record, including a feature-length documentary of the expedition called The Secret Land, built entirely from footage shot by the Navy's own cameraman, showing precisely what Highjump was: ships, ice, aircraft, cold and exhausting work. One of these accounts comes with film of the real events. The other comes with a diary that no one can produce. Antarctica is, in its way, the perfect canvas for all of this. It is genuinely remote, genuinely hostile, genuinely closed to ordinary people, and genuinely the subject of real secrecy and real strategic interest. Onto that blank white space, almost anything can be projected. And the less most people can check, the more freely the stories grow. That is the uncomfortable lesson buried in this story. The Navy ran a hard training exercise and came home early because of the weather is accurate and almost no one repeats it. Admiral Byrd fought a UFO battle against surviving Nazis under the ice is false, and millions have heard it. The legend is simply a better story, and it was, in part, manufactured by someone who needed you to believe it. There is a way to guard yourself against stories like this, and it is not cynicism. It is a single, patient question. Where did this version come from, and who first told it? A claim's age, its confidence, and the number of times it has been repeated tell you nothing about whether it is true. But trace it back to its source, and the truth often stands plainly revealed. A strategic exercise here, a propagandist's motive there. The flying saucers under the ice did not come from the men who were actually aboard those ships. They came, decades later, from someone with a reason to want them believed. So let us be exact about what is true. In 1946 and 1947, the United States sent the largest expedition in history to Antarctica. Roughly 4,700 men, 13 ships, 33 aircraft, under the famous Admiral Byrd, to train for polar warfare, test equipment in extreme cold, and photograph the continent from the air. It mapped vast stretches of coastline. It lost 3 men when a seaplane crashed in a whiteout, and it left after a single summer season, driven north not by an enemy but by the oncoming winter. Everything beyond that, the hidden base, the flying saucers, the battle beneath the ice, is fiction, and not even innocent fiction. It was shaped and spread decades later by a propagandist who wanted the world to believe the Nazis were never truly beaten. A fleet on the ice at the end of the world, 3 graves and a crashed plane, thousands of photographs of a coast no one had ever seen, and then a quiet retreat ahead of the cold. That is the real Operation Highjump. The version with the saucers is louder and easier to love, and it has nearly buried the truth, which may be the most useful thing this whole story has to teach. That the better a legend sounds, the more worth asking who first told it and why.